Ladies, gentlemen, and those in between, today we're going to be talking about the most American thing ever. And I'm, of course, talking about
racism.
Today we're talking about the second most American thing ever, and I'm, of course, talking about free market capitalism and why it sucks ass. So you're probably wondering why I'm making a video so, well, American in January. And that's because time is a social construct and it will not be constrained by it. Anyways, you've probably seen a lot of videos critiquing capitalism, which may or may not have better arguments than me and a much higher production value. And I'm sure at this point someone's probably typing,
"Oh my god, we get it. You hate capitalism because you're not a good cam boy."
And first off, I could be a good cam boy. I've taken 8 inches before. And second, I'll stop talking about capitalism when you guys stop electing corrupt bureaucrats and actually do something about it. But of course, there's probably a lot of you that are completely unconvinced that capitalism is even bad in the first place. And you probably clicked in this video and thought, I'm gonna own this libtard with my witty comment about Trump. Well, first, no. And second, maybe you could at least listen to my arguments before you actually leave your shitty comment. After all, isn't that what this whole free marketplace of ideas thing is all about? So I thought I would go through some common arguments for capitalism and show you why they're complete bullshit. And our first defender of the capitalist cabal is none other than intellectual titan and leftist feeling slayer Ben Shapiro. He is author of such amazing works such as
Ben Shapiro destroys transgenderism and pro-abortion arguments. Ben Shapiro rips pro-choice student at Berkeley. Ben Shapiro destroys Don Lemon on Confederate statues.
My dream is for someone to do to my ass what Ben Shapiro does to the feelings of his opponents. In any case, in the much less intensely titled, well, I'll just let him say it.
Did we need the government to end private segregation? The answer is brought to you by our friends over at Birch Gold. To learn how to safeguard your IRA or 401k.
Oops, how did that get there? Anyways, in this video, Ben argues that the free market is actually much better than the government at ending discrimination.
Without invading the rights of private business owners to choose their clientele.
Whatever that means. And that big bad government is actually what's needed to enforce discrimination. And if you're wondering if Ben thinks that the government should never have enforced desegregation in the first place, you'd be right.
Or what I said was flawed about the Civil Rights Act of '64 was not 8 of the 10 titles that talk about what the government can and cannot do. What I said was flawed is the government forcing private business owners into doing things.
To argue this, Ben cites 2 incidents during the Civil Rights era, namely the Woolworth sit-ins and the Montgomery bus boycotts. But there are a few problems with this argument. First off, the whole not invading the rights of private citizens is kind of the same argument that slaveholders used against abolitionists. Second, during the video, Ben Shapiro says this.
In February 1960, 4 black students in Greensboro, North Carolina sat down at the counter at Woolworth's, a segregated restaurant. This was 4 years before the Civil Rights Act forcibly integrated restaurants. The students who sat down at the counter led a boycott against Woolworths. By July 1960, Woolworth's lunch counter desegregated itself.
Did you catch that? The boycott stopped the discrimination even though the Jim Crow laws were still in effect in North Carolina. That's because the businesses that didn't enforce segregation didn't really receive any kind of reprimand from the government, as the restaurant operated for 4 years while the Jim Crow laws were in effect without any problems from the government. However, curiously, a history article entitled The Greensboro Sit-ins says the restaurant quietly desegregated. Now that's an interesting choice of words. Why did the restaurant desegregate very quietly? Well, that's because they didn't want to face the threats and violence that ensued in many other places. For example, after the Montgomery buses were desegregated, Rosa Parks was eventually forced to leave the state due to death threats and employment blacklisting. Snipers fired into buses, shattering the legs of a pregnant woman, and a bomb had to be defused at Martin Luther King's house. And 4 black churches and prominent black leaders were bombed as well. On September 10th, 1957, Haiti Cotton Elementary School in Tennessee was bombed, and I could do a whole video on the violence the Free Riders experienced. This is why Central High School in Little Rock required U.S. Army troops to escort the 9 African American students to class when the school desegregated. Even after the Montgomery buses were desegregated and the violence calmed down, black people still ended up sitting at the back of the buses, despite the fact that the buses were no longer segregated and that African Americans actually made up 75% of their fares. So despite the fact that the buses were officially desegregated, they were still self-segregating because there was just that much bigotry at the time. The boycotts did little in and of themselves to actually end segregation in the South, and for the most part, black Southerners' lives were actually for the most part the same. However, what the boycotts did do was launch forward the civil rights movement, which ended up changing the lives of many African Americans much more broadly for the better. The free market only ended up ending discrimination in a very specific instance, whereas the Civil Rights Act propelled the quality of living for many African Americans tremendously. The free market did nothing to end racism and only to stop discrimination in a very specific instance after they started losing money. Therefore, the phrase,
"Free markets only care about one color, green,"
is fucking bullshit because both the businesses and the customers are not divorced from their own prejudices just because there's lots of money involved. But even if we ignore all of this context, I still find Ben Shapiro's argument quite disgusting, because I can't help but remember this quote from Martin Luther King.
I must confess that over the past few years, I have been greatly disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, "I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action," who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season.
You see, in this case, Ben Shapiro is the white moderate, and the timetable Ben is using is the free market. And he's using the free market not to determine whether or not someone can have rights, but whether or not the market will abuse them. So according to Ben, we should just let the free market decide whether or not you have to face unemployment or not have access to important services. Well, I, for one, don't think the free market should decide whether or not you are treated fairly. This is especially concerning considering that LGBT people have been in some ways facing the same kind of discrimination. Ben Shapiro even admits this.
Now, this isn't to claim there aren't racists who would resist tolerance.
You're right, Ben. There are people who would resist tolerance of others. People like Ben Shapiro.
We've seen adoption agencies in places like Massachusetts actually shut down if they prefer to hand a baby over to a traditional male-female couple as opposed to a same-sex couple. Now, I think that there is a perfectly secular, rational case for handing a baby over to a male and a female, because I don't think that males and females are the same. I don't think fathers and mothers are the same.
And there are also those that don't like it when businesses stop acting in bigoted ways, like when Chick-fil-A stopped donating to anti-LGBT organizations. People like Ben Shapiro.
Chick-fil-A has survived and thrived because they served everyone and refused to cater to cancel culture. Now they've caved at the behest of the centrist left. This is a terrible move, and just the latest indicator that the center cannot hold.
Wow, it's almost as if Ben Shapiro is just a dishonest hack who's just using this argument to discriminate against the gays. Now, I think it would be irresponsible of me for not to point out that Ben Shapiro is completely wrong when it comes to gay parents, and that Chick-fil-A is still donating to several anti-LGBT organizations. They only stopped donating to 2. But the point is that this isn't really a genuine argument for capitalism. It's Ben using the disdain most people have for racial prejudice as a tool to argue for the free markets. He can then use said defense in arguing against similar protections for queer people, so that anyone can use that same kind of discrimination against them. It's equally parts clever and despicable. Anyways, I think that's enough for Ben for now.
And remember, if you're interested in that free kit about investing in precious metals,
fuck off, Ben. Our next defender of capitalism comes through a PragerU video, so you know it's going to be full of shit. The defender in question is none other than prolific economist George Giles, who once said such brilliant things such as,
Indian culture didn't fail because it was virtuous. It failed because it was a corrupt and unsuccessful culture. These tribal cultures they are trying to import from Africa are tragic failures too. To uphold these destructive cultures that have been virtual social suicide for the people who live in them is a terrible perversion. If the power of choice is given up, the woman actually ascends to a higher level of sexuality, and her body attains an almost mystical power over men.
and won such prestigious awards as the Male Chauvinist Pig Award in 1986. I'm starting to notice a trend. In this PragerU video, George Giles essentially begins by saying that capitalism turns self-interest into altruism somehow. How does he back up this claim? Well, he doesn't. They just show an infographic in which they pull their own definition of entrepreneur out of their ass, as if that's the accepted definition, and then proceeds to tell the audience,
Few economists, however, actually study the behavior of these entrepreneurs.
bitch, what? Like, what do you think economists do? Like, when I searched my school database for entrepreneurial behavior, I got like 6 peer-reviewed articles like on the first page. This guy's supposed to be a brilliant economist? The only reason I could possibly think of him saying this is so that he wouldn't have to cite any sources, which makes sense considering this entire video is just him asserting without evidence that capitalism is altruism for 3 minutes. The only real argument he makes throughout the video is this.
If the entrepreneur pursues his own interests first and his customers' interests second, his business will fail. And sooner or later, an altruistic entrepreneur will surpass him.
Now, I guess this could work if you had 2 mom and pop shops with similar business models and the owner of one of them was just a massive prick. But as soon as you introduce a juggernaut like Walmart to the equation, you realize just how much of a dumpster fire this argument is. If you've known anyone who's worked for Walmart, you know that they treat their employees like shit. I have several extended family members who've actually worked for Walmart, and they all describe the same experience. Long shifts, garbage hours, and they don't get paid enough. And these aren't just some anecdotes from some disgruntled employees, there's data to back it up. Several economic studies have independently shown that Walmart stores actually reduced retail employment and retail wages, not increased them, thus costing the business less. And according to a 2012 estimate in South Seattle, a Walmart opening up in the area would cost the local economy about $10.01 million in economic output and $13.24 million in labor income. Furthermore, regardless of how altruistic, most mom and pop shops can't even compete with Walmart, as Walmart consistently matches and undercuts the prices of many mom and pop shops until they close. This is especially devastating to rural areas, as that basically leaves Walmart as the only grocery store and pharmacy in the area. And in 2016, Walmart closed more than 269 stores, leaving many of the communities which skewed elderly no choice but to go at least 50 miles to get essentials and prescriptions. Walmart essentially screwed over thousands of their customers, and yet they are still one of the most successful corporations on the planet. It's almost as if altruism has little to nothing to do with the success of a business. The entire video is nothing but this guy's assertions, and the only reason these assertions are being taken seriously is because he's an economist with a good reputation, or at least good by right-wing standards. His argument makes little sense, and he has little to no evidence to back up anything he says, because capitalism isn't really this fluffy altruistic system he imagines it to be. Now at this point of the video, I'm sure someone's probably commenting,
You're only talking about bad arguments for capitalism. You haven't made any arguments against capitalism.
and you're right, I haven't. And that's because I knew if I just started with my arguments against capitalism, well, you just tell me to watch some Ben Shapiro or PragerU or something. So I thought I would beat you to the punch and just show you that these arguments really aren't as good as you think they are. So why don't we get into the arguments against capitalism, shall we? 1. The wealth gap. Now I know as soon as I mentioned the wealth gap, about half of you probably thought about the last Bernie Sanders meme you saw on that Republican meme page that's trying to sell you brain pills. And the other half is probably commenting,
Other people have more money because they work different jobs. Do you really think a McDonald's worker should be paid the same as an EMT?
well, no, having more money isn't in and of itself a problem. The problem lies in a few individuals having a ridiculously large amounts of wealth and what problems that causes, which are twofold. 1A. Obscene decadence and struggling single mothers. Poverty has a plethora of adverse effects on people, from impending education to heightened stress and poor physical health, and as of 2018, about 81 million Americans had jobs that were paid at or below the federal minimum wage, over 50% of which were over the age of 25. This is concerning considering the fact that the U.S. Government Accountability Office recently published a study that showed that current federal minimum wage of $7.25 was essentially a poverty trap, as 20% of working families earning $7.25 an hour live in poverty, as well as 13% earning $12 an hour and 5% earning $16 an hour. And people who work at jobs that pay lower than minimum wage, such as servers, are 2 times more likely to live in poverty. These people definitely deserve to be paid more, especially considering that if the federal minimum wage had kept up with inflation, it would be closer to $12 an hour. and if it would have kept up with the increase in worker productivity, it would be closer to $21. And to go back to the McDonald's versus EMT worker, if you really think that EMT workers deserve more money, then by all means pay them more. But that shouldn't be used as a bludgeon against other people just trying to survive. People often say stuff like this, but then expect top-notch service from their McDonald's workers, and will freak out if they get their order of a cheeseburger with extra ketchup and fries wrong. Sorry your order took so long, sir, but I was stressing about whether or not I was going to pay rent this month. And that's just among the more fortunate people. As of 2018, over 550,000 Americans are considered homeless, and most estimates put those who have some kind of employment at only about 25%. And about 1/3 of the homeless were unsheltered, which is far worse impact on people such as poor physical health, increased substance abuse disorders, and increased chronic health problems. Meanwhile, Jeff Bezos literally has enough money to end homelessness in America and still have over $80 billion left over. And that's just one guy. If you combine the wealth of the top 5 wealthiest Americans, they would essentially be able to pay less than 5% of their wealth and solve homelessness overnight. Literally 5 people, and they would still have tens, if not hundreds of billions left over. But they don't really give a shit about helping poor people. In fact, those millionaires would rather pay over $100,000 on a banana duct tape to a wall for the tax break rather than help them. People like Paul Joseph Watson like to blame the decline in art on postmodernism or something, but no, it's because rich asshats only care to buy anything as long as someone deigns to utter the blasphemy it's art and it's expensive enough to give them that sweet, sweet tax break. You see, this is what we mean when we say the wealth gap is a problem. We have created a system that essentially traps many people in a cycle of poverty. Meanwhile, we have a few individuals who literally have enough money to solve the most pressing economic issues overnight and still be the richest people on the planet. Yet they choose to hoard that wealth in some bank somewhere, or to spend it on bananas, duct tape to walls, or ice cream sundaes, or pizzas made of gold. The system isn't working, or at least it's not working to benefit most people, and that's just one effect of the wealth gap. We still have to talk about 1B. Your vote doesn't fucking matter. The ultra-rich have essentially entrenched themselves in our democracy in such a way that our democracy is starting to function less and less like one. Because the US Supreme Court has ruled that money equals free speech, billionaires are essentially allowed to pour millions of dollars into our campaigns and elections. The average salary of a congressman is around $170,000. Yet the median income is about 4 times that at over $500,000, with many congressmen having incomes of over $100 million. And no, the reason for this is not because so many constituents donate money, as in the 2012 election, the majority of donations for congressional races came from individuals donating $1,000 or more. Billionaires regularly lobby politicians to sway their votes, and it works. And as if the absurdly high salaries were proof enough, a study found that politicians' votes on average tend to reflect their donors far more than their constituents. And another study found that wealthy individuals have 15 times the political efficacy than the average person in the middle class. Thus, because although the overwhelming majority of people believe the government should play some role in wealth distribution, because only 55% of the wealthy agree, you're probably going to get a lot more tax breaks for the wealthy, which is how you get laws that allow people to get tax breaks for applying blasphemies that I will not deign to call art. Hell, billionaires aren't even the only ones who lobby politicians. Corporations do the same thing, and it's destroying our democracy. Because now, politicians aren't representing the interests of the people who elected them, but rather the people who are lining their pockets. And speaking of corporations... 2. Healthcare. Capitalism has essentially invaded every aspect of our society, including the healthcare system. Now, why exactly is that a bad thing? Well, let me ask you this. How much would you pay to live? And that's not a very fair question, is it? And corporations know this and essentially put a price tag on your life. And that price tag can be essentially anything because they know you will pay any amounts of money to live. This is why life-saving drugs like insulin cost $2 to $6 to produce, yet patients are charged upwards of $150 to sometimes $300 per vial. It's essentially the same product, but they continuously charge more and more for the same product. Insulin has become so expensive that a recent study found that 1 in 4 insulin users administer smaller doses than they're supposed to, and even skip on doses entirely in order to save on insulin. This is despite the fact that insulin could be far cheaper and companies could still make plenty of money. Why are these corporations doing this? Well, because they can. There are regulations when it comes to medical costs, but they are extremely lax, and thus businesses can continuously charge more and more for insulin, and it's getting people killed. Just recently, Jessame Schreier-Radcliffe died because she couldn't afford insulin, and she isn't the only one. And it's not just insulin that has ridiculously high prices. EpiPens, Truvada, and pretty much any other kind of medical treatment out there. It's all expensive because corporations know that you have no choice but to pay it. And it's not just a major flaw with capitalism, but it's one with a body count. 3. The rentier economy. The rentier economy is described as economic practices of monopolization of access to any kind of property and gaining significant amounts of profit without contributing to society. What this basically means is that as things tend more and more towards monopoly, the less companies innovate and the more and more they charge you for the same product or services. You can find numerous examples of this in the video game industry. For example, many video game corporations are moving more and more towards something called live services. Basically what this means is that the companies are selling you pieces of the game that you've already bought. One such example is Shadow of War. In the game, you play as the character Talion, but later on in the game you are introduced to two other characters, Altariel and Baranor, and the story of the main game sets up the stories for their respective DLCs, where you can play as either character. Hell, there's even a promotion that pops up in-game for the DLC that appears as soon as their story chronologically begins in the game. Why isn't this just included in the game? Because they know you buy it. Another example is DLC that's seemingly there not because it adds anything interesting to the game, but just so it can be there for you to buy it. Like the Hearthfire DLC in Skyrim. Like, what was the point of that? I bought this game to slay dragons and delve into dungeons, not build a house and raise a little shit. And DLC isn't the only live service that games are offering now. I haven't talked about loot boxes, and I could go on for hours about microtransactions. But this is kind of a weird move for video game companies to make, considering live services require a stable internet connection and credit card, but the majority of the world don't have access to that. In other words, they're not looking for innovative new ways to reach a wider audience, they're basically looking for more and more ways to make more money off the same audience. You see, this is what I mean when I say the rentier economy makes money off of owning access to property rather than contributing to society. These live services are essentially selling you more of the game you already paid for, and it's making game companies a lot of money. In fact, many games have gone so far as to deliberately design their games for DLC to be added later, such as how the story in Shadow of War was written. PhilosophyTube did a great video which went into much greater depth than this video, which I will link in the description. The video game industry isn't even the only one. Take glasses, for example. If you're wearing them, you're probably wearing something made by a company called Luxottica. They design and manufacture glasses for many different brands, and even own some brands outright, such as Ray-Bans. However, they own more than just brands of glasses. They also own the locations from which they are sold, such as Target Optical, Lens Crafters, and Oliver Peoples, and many more. 60 Minutes actually did a story about the company, and it is insane how much power they have over the market. For example, at one point, Luxottica stopped selling its competitor Oakley at any of the stores they owned, including Sunglasses Hut. When this happened, Oakley's stock prices dropped dramatically, and then Luxottica bought Oakley. And it doesn't just stop there. Luxottica also owns a large portion of the vision insurance markets. So essentially, Luxottica makes them, sells them, and insures them. In fact, Luxottica is even cracking down and giving people their pupil distance measurements, which is very important when purchasing glasses, in order to make it harder for you to buy glasses online, which is currently Luxottica's biggest competitor. They're essentially trying to create a closed system so that you have to get your prescription, frames, and insurance all through Luxottica, essentially creating a monopoly. Now at this point, if you're an American viewer, you might be typing,
If this were happening, the government would step in and stop them because monopolies are illegal.
but here's the thing, Luxottica is an Italian company. Our government can't do shit. And that's one of the big problems with the free market. They eventually get so good at outdoing the competition that there ends up being a lot less competition, and companies end up charging more for the same product. And it's not just making video games more expensive, but also everything else. 4. Equity versus equality. Now, if you're active on right-wing YouTube around 2014 to 2016, you probably saw a graphic like this somewhere, and they probably explain why this graphic demonstrates that equal opportunity is perfect in every way, and that any kind of equity-based approach is the second coming of Stalin or something. However, I'm going to show you how this graphic demonstrates the exact opposite. For one thing, the only way for this system to be fair is for everyone to start on an uneven playing field, and that's just demonstrably not the case. For example, people who have disabilities have historically not been treated well. In the 18th to the 19th century, people with disabilities were typically sent to workhouses, where they were put to work in hopes of rehabilitation. However, these places were typically dirty, overcrowded, and had little oversight. In fact, many of these workhouses were purposefully designed to be unpleasant places, so that the tenants would not want to stay long as to speed up rehabilitation. But as many psychiatrists later pointed out, that's not how disabilities work. Thanks to the work of these psychiatrists, coalitions of disabled people and their parents and caretakers, as well as tireless activism, Ben Shapiro's everywhere were angered by the passing of civil rights and non-discrimination laws for disabled people. However, despite these laws, disabled people still face a lot of barriers to employment. According to a 2013 British study by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, disabled people were at a disadvantage by every metric measured by the study. To name just a few examples, disabled people were less likely to be economically active, i.e. employed or actively seeking employment, and of those economically active, disabled people are more likely to be unemployed. The transition from full-time education was more difficult for disabled people, and disabled people are more likely to work lower-skilled and lower-paid jobs.
And this is after we gave disabled people the thing that Ben Shapiro hates. Furthermore, the market not only made it harder for disabled people despite non-discrimination laws, but it can also take advantage of those people.
In 1978, Congress banned the use of lead as an additive to paint as it was found to cause permanent brain damage in children. However, a lot of landlords didn't bother to replace the old paint. This has led to tens of thousands of children being added to the Department of Environment's lead registry, many of which were awarded structured settlements. Then, some unscrupulous lawyer firms cropped up, swooped in, and offered to buy the settlements for a lump sum, with a small fraction of the full settlement. Many of these people can barely read and end up signing the agreements. Thus, thousands of people end up being collectively cheated out of millions of dollars.
This all happened because the system deemed these people to be capable of understanding what they were signing, when clearly they weren't. And you don't even have to have any kind of disability to be at a disadvantage. You just have to be poor, and poverty disproportionately affects people of color.
In 1934, the FHA adopted a policy known as redlining, in which neighborhoods with significant black populations were marked red on maps, and anyone within these regions received little to no financial help or backing from the FHA, regardless of individual credibility. This left many black Americans vulnerable to predatory loan companies. These companies would essentially create unfairly priced loans with abusive terms that would allow the lender to resell the borrower's home after a single missed payment. And because black Americans were essentially denied any other form of loan from the FHA, they were essentially forced to sign these loans. This led to increased levels of poverty, and many studies have shown that poverty increases crime and vice versa, thus creating a vicious cycle. How has this affected black neighborhoods today? Well, let's take a look at the redlining map of Baltimore again. Now, let's look at this map of police stops in Baltimore, with red representing areas of high black populations, and blue dots representing police stops. Now, take a look at this map outlining poverty in the Baltimore area, with red representing high levels of poverty. They tend to overlap a lot, don't they?
This is why capitalism is number 2. In any case, our economy will not only trample those at a disadvantage, but also squeeze as much money out of them as possible while doing so.
5. The inevitable objections.
So our economic system is fucked. It's putting a lot of people in poverty, giving a ton of money into just a few individuals who are more interested in hoarding it than actually helping people. It's making literally everything more expensive, and it's letting people die. But I understand that because capitalism is the only system you know, there are probably going to be some objections, like,
Stop trying to take away my video games, commie bastard.
because as a boy after a man's own heart, I know what men want. I know how to speak to their hearts. It's through his dick. And to that, I have to say, I don't think people will stop making video games if capitalism ends. To that end, I propose a study case of Ben Drowned. Now, a lot of you have probably read the creepypasta, and maybe some of you have seen the YouTube videos, but what you probably didn't know is the horror ARG experience that went with it. In case you haven't noticed, I've been on a bit of a deep web horror binge, and my grades have suffered way too much for this to all go to waste. Anyways,
While the Ben Drowned videos were being uploaded, posts on 4chan were being made by the upload of the videos detailing how he got the game and what was happening both in and out of the game. Eventually, a file called thetruth.txt was released, which was a complete journal about what was happening to him. After the text document was released, another video was uploaded called free.wave. This, along with coded messages on his profile, led players to a cult website called youshouldn'thavedonethat.com. The website was essentially the home base for a cult called the Moon Children, and the story progressed through posts made by the cult members, players' exploration of the site, and by emailing members of the cult. After some interaction with the players, something unexpected happened. Alex Hall, the game's creator, broke the illusion of the game in order to explain why the game was stalling and answer questions. Basically revealed that as a college student, the time and financial constraints had become too much. He eventually did continue the game after some spontaneous donations. However, despite this, the game stalled again, as the final act required the development of an actual game to be developed in Unity 3D, and he actually paid for some staff to help with the development out of his own pocket, which was set to release in 2016, although it was never released. Although to this day the final arc remains unresolved, Alex Hall recently uploaded an otherwise unrelated video with the tags Ben Drowned and Why Are You Reading This?
If you want to learn more, I have linked a video in the description which goes into much greater depth in the story and goes over a lot of the parts I skipped over. Anyways, my point is that despite the fact that he knew it wasn't going to be profitable from the get-go, he still did it. He did it because he wanted to create something that others would enjoy and remember. And it eventually became something that would be permanently etched into the history of the internet as one of the greatest creepypastas and horror ARG experiences. But that doesn't exactly put food on the table. And yet he still did it. And there are plenty of other horror ARG experiences out there that took a lot of time, effort, and in some cases even money to create. And yet none of them are making any money. You see, this is why I don't think things like video games will disappear if capitalism went away. There are plenty of people that are just passionate about their craft and will do it regardless of whether or not they're being paid for it. In fact, I think things like video games could in fact benefit from being liberated from capitalism. The creators would be able to essentially make whatever they wanted without interference from executives only concerned with the bottom line, and games wouldn't be cut up into smaller pieces in order to make a bigger profit.
Stop trying to resurrect Stalin. He killed 50 million people.
Look, just because I don't like capitalism doesn't mean I'm a communist. And just because someone's a communist doesn't mean they want to install an authoritarian regime. Any more than you saying you like capitalism means that you think Mexico's economy is great. Communism, socialism, and Marxism are three related but separate things, and there are nuances within each. If you mash all three together, you're basically setting yourself up to strawman the other person. But to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what ideology I subscribe to, apart from it not being one that prescribes an authoritarian regime. But I do know there are some socialist policies I like, such as universal healthcare, which has been successfully implemented in pretty much every other developed country, or a higher federal minimum wage. Basically, what I want at a bare minimum is a social democracy, and that has worked for places like Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, and I don't see why that can't work here.
You wouldn't be mad about capitalism if you were a good cam boy.
Look, I get it. You're horny, repressed, and would love for nothing more than for me to take off more than just my shirt. And I get it. I mean, I used to be as repressed as you, and I am hot as fuck. I mean, I'd fuck me. But if I were making a living selling nudes, you just say I'm a hypocrite because I'm succeeding under capitalism. And if people succeeding under capitalism can't criticize it because they're hypocrites, those failing can't because they're resentful, and not participating isn't an option, then who exactly is allowed to criticize capitalism then? Epilogue. What the hell am I supposed to do? Now, at this point, you're probably commenting,
What do you expect me to do about this? Give random homeless people money?
well, yeah. Well, not to just random people in the street, but giving money to charities can actually do a lot of good. There's a lot of research that shows when cash aid was given to poor families, children had more time for school and work, and that the family's nutrition and health improved. But, as a recent study has discovered, the effects actually went much deeper. What the study did was give $1,000 to 10,500 households out of a total of 65,000 households and track the economic impact on all 65,000 families. What the study found was that for every dollar given to the families, economic activity increased by about $2.60. Now, this study did find that the effects were temporary, and I'm sure you probably don't have $1,000 to give out, except you, Jeff. We all know you've got it. But even just helping a little is better than nothing. In the description, I'm going to link a couple of charities that I think are really helpful. And there are plenty of other things you can do to help with a more permanent solution, like vote for people who don't have million-dollar donors, supports grassroots movements for things like a higher federal minimum wage or universal health care. In the description, I'm going to link an article which will basically show you how to be more politically active, which will hopefully help in that regard. But even just talking about it can help. You can convince others of its importance and even just convince one more person to vote Labor or Democrat in the next election. Just don't do it like your racist uncle does at every Thanksgiving. And if there are any chuds still watching who are still okay with being the bitch of capitalism, I dare you to comment. I fucking dare you. I have 4 pages of sources, and with them I will burn the bourgeoisie. There will be no survivors. The capitalists will sell us the rope with which we will hang them. Special thanks to Pakistallion, Udita, and Peter/Ethel for providing their voices, and to my roommate Adam for operating the camera and making this video just that much less of a hot mess. You can check out their content by checking the description, and if you enjoy seeing these slow-moving train wrecks, you can subscribe and maybe donate to my Patreon. God knows I need it.